I just want to start this video off with a brief disclaimer that I am currently sick as of taping this, so consequently that is why my voice sounds funny. However, I'm making this video at the request of a viewer who I will place a photo of his comment right now. But this is a YouTube video about iOS 4 in 2025, so without further ado, let's get started. So, iOS 4 released in 2010. The devices that launched with iOS 4 were the iPhone 4, the iPod Touch 4th generation, and the iPad 2, which I do have an iPad 2, but it's not on iOS 4. And what did iOS 4 bring in comparison to iPhone OS 3? Well, first of all, iOS 4 brought the addition of the home screen wallpaper on iPhones and iPod Touches, which was previously only available on the iPad. And furthermore, iOS 4 was also the first version of iOS to be called iOS on the iPhone and iPod Touches. Previously, it was just known as iOS on the iPad. And another feature of iOS 4 is that it brought the multitasking bar, which not only lets you close out apps and easily switch between them, but also lets you control like various things like music and other features like that, and lock rotation. And you also got the ability to group apps into folders on iOS 4. As on iOS 3, if I try to group apps together, as you can tell, it won't work. However, if I try to group apps together on iOS 4, works like a charm, as you can tell. And a quick notice is that the home screen wallpaper and the multitasking bar are not natively supported on the iPhone 3G and iPod Touch 2nd generation. And furthermore, iOS 4 is also the first version of iOS to actually drop models of iPhones and iPod Touches, because the first generation iPhones and iPod Touch, they do not get iOS 4. iOS 4.1 introduced the Game Center app on all iOS devices except for the iPhone 3G. The Game Center app basically lets you log in with your Apple ID and then play with friends and whatnot. And iOS 4.2, they changed the voice memos icon right here to be this blue one instead of this red one. And in iOS 4.3, they changed the FaceTime icon to be instead of the previous green one, which I'll show you guys if I go into the wallpaper section of this one. As you can tell, it used to be green. However, now it is silver. Interestingly enough, iOS 4.3 is actually unsupported on the iPhone 3G and iPod 2nd generation because they got left on iOS 4.2.1. However, the CDMA iPhone 4, which came out in early 2011, also did not get iOS 4.3. For this, instead got iOS 4.2.x, which I'll show you right. 4.2.6 through 4.2.10, which I'll show you right here. This one right here runs 4.2.6. And there were some early review units that got iOS 4.2.5, which is super rare. However, what about actually using iOS 4 in 2025? Well, if you jailbreak your devices running iOS 4, which is relatively easy, you can sideload apps via AppSync for iOS 4.0. However, I haven't tried that, because I have installed apps on some iOS 4 devices, but that was back when the App Store still worked with the Checkmate Store. And if you want to downgrade to iOS 4, it is signed on the iPhone 3GS and iPod Touch 3rd generation, so you can just downgrade straight there. I have tutorials for how to do both. And you can downgrade these with Legacy iOS Kit on the iPhone 4 and the iPad 1, which is what I've done. However, if you have a CDMA iPhone 4 or a GSM 2012 iPhone 4, you can't, but the most common GSM 2010 iPhone 4, you can. And you can do a temporary downgrade, although I haven't gotten it to work on the iPod Touch 4th generation. And although I haven't tested this either, you can apparently dual boot the iPad 2 to iOS 4. But iOS 4 is actually probably one of the most important versions of iOS to me, because it was actually the first version of iOS I ever used. Because back on my original iPad 1, this isn't it, for that one is long gone. I got that back in early 2011 because I stole my mom's iPad and she let me keep it. At that ran iOS 4, and so as a result, it was the first ever version of iOS that I used. And obviously, look at where that iPad led me to. So in a sense, I kind of have to owe this to iOS 4. What are your guys' experiences with iOS 4? Please comment that down below. As always, thank you all for watching this video. I'm the iTunes Fanboy, and peace out.